Next, the last item on tonight's agenda is on guiding principles and factors for repurposing, consolidations, boundaries, and better facilities. The following commitment and strategy of the AISD 2015-2020 strategic plan is being addressed, which is commitment 8, generate, leverage, and utilize strategically all resources, and strategies 8.1, we will acquire necessary resources. Dr. Cruz.
Thank you, President Rodriguez and board members. So this is a continuation of our discussion from our retreat that we had a couple of weeks ago. The board had asked for us to present a draft of guiding principles and the factors. And so this is the continuation of that discussion from our group work. Staff members have come together from each area and then made revisions to the draft that you see before you now. I'll ask Matthias and Michelle to maybe just make some opening comments on how we got to this point. Remember, in the last time, just as to recall, each trustee was in groups, presented information, so they've taken what were the common elements. So it's not just the one changed it, so they're taking commonalities and trying to then reflect the board's work collectively into this particular document. Let me ask Michelle and Matthias if any comments to add to it.
Thank you. So we want to point back to, sorry, I wasn't on.
Yeah.
Thank you, sorry.
Don't make Bobby mad. He'll
call me.
His voice always comes on.
Right.
We hear you, Bobby.
So if I want to just remind you back on the roadmap. If you look at April, where we are is introducing the guiding principles. And so that's what we're here tonight to look at the revisions to the guiding principles that you worked on recently. And so if you go over to the guiding principles document and look at the top, we have that we're committed to ensuring fabulous schools inside and out. And then the other big statements at the top, all schools will be considered, all schools will be fabulous and comprise the best staff, teachers, and administrators. All factors will be measured both regionally and per student per campus. All guiding principles endeavor to improve equity and alignment with board policy work, and all means all. And then under the first guiding principle there, ensure equitable access to programmatic opportunities that engage and inspire all students. And so there were some revisions to that based on your input from that work session. And then you can see the factors below it, increasing the comprehensive menu of programs to appeal to diverse student needs that might mitigate programmatic deserts, that consider all regions for a district-wide holistic approach plus climate, strengthen the connection of programming within the feeder pattern, ensure specialized services and programs are provided to meet the diversity of student needs and remove barriers to academic success, and then ensure the access and availability of after-school and extracurricular offerings.
Matthias Segura, Operations Officer for the school district. Guiding principle number 2, put more students in reimagined 21st century learning environments that engage and inspire. Increase average ESA scores, that's Educational Suitability Assessment scores. Increase average facility condition assessment scores. Increase building utilization while considering programs and boundaries. Maintain same accountability rating or higher. Reduce portable classrooms. Do not add students to create over-enrolled schools. Strengthen and stabilize population levels within feeder patterns. Guiding principle number 3, maintain neighborhood schools. Consider road patterns, travel duration, proximity, and stop times to increase number of students with reasonable access to an elementary school. And optimize opportunities for socioeconomic diversity while balancing proximity to neighborhood schools. Guiding principle number 4, reduce financial obligations not directed towards student learning and support. Redirect reinvestment to student support. Mitigate projected increase in transportation costs. Consider impact of transportation costs on program access. Minimize negative impact to taxpayers. Reduce deferred maintenance costs. Guiding principle number 5, optimize facility use to benefit students, families, and communities. And with that includes partner with municipalities, healthcare organizations, county governments, the City of Austin, Travis County, and others to align assets with our community needs, affordable housing, which may include affordable housing, private development, recreation spaces, shared use, social services, and workforce housing. And then maximize opportunities for co-location, NGOs, nonprofits, and other partners in facilities or shared sites. So this is the culmination of the board retreat, the feedback we received. We're anxious to get any feedback you all might have, and then talk about steps forward. Just so all the trustees are aware, we are in the process of developing with staff the regions that will be used for the planning process. We don't have them developed just yet. The goal is to bring staff together based on the guiding principles and everything we've learned to date, formulate them, work with our reinvention subcommittee and our steering committee, which includes Michelle, Nicole, and Jacob, and then bring different ideas to Dr. Cruz for kind of stimulation purposes, and then we'll begin to present those to the board as we move through the process. So we'll pause there and begin.
Trustees, comments or questions? Trustee Tyke?
So I would like to, first of all, thank you. This is what we came up with from our discussions at our retreat. And while I like the word fabulous, I would love to find something that's probably a little you know, English majors, we're all going like, really? So if we could find a word, a synonym that's, what was the word? A little more, not so, I don't know how to say that, professional. So if we could think of that, and that might be something that trustees could come across with. I think that at first blush, we thought, yes, that's great. And then I was thinking about it like, so how would that come across to our public? I don't know. Anyway, so if we can think along those lines. Also, we've had some community input through some emails that I really value from people whose opinions I value. And so looking under number 3, where it says maintain neighborhood schools, perhaps we should move letter B up into that category. That's a suggestion. As in, Roman numeral 3 would be optimize opportunities for socioeconomic diversity while balancing proximity to neighborhood schools. That might fit better with our efforts at equity and fit better with our efforts to not increase segregation in our schools. And another suggestion would be that no more than 52.4% of students experiencing school consolidation or closure during this process should be economically disadvantaged. So placing a number on, as we're deciding on school consolidation, we should consider that no more than 52.4% of students experiencing school, and I can give you this language later, school consolidation or closure during this process should be economically disadvantaged. I think we should look at that, take that into consideration, use that number, and I will forward that language to you. I think that would be that would help us avoid consolidations falling upon our most vulnerable students and families. So I'll forward that language to you. And that's a consideration that we can place somewhere in this document. I don't know where exactly we would put that, but that's just a suggestion. And I appreciate the community input that I've received related to this document. And I want to acknowledge that and place that up for consideration, basically. So those are my comments for now.
Trustee Mathias?
I think my comments are mostly about the all statements at the top. So all schools will be considered. I simply want to push back and ask whether all schools will be considered. That is to say, it seems we're investing millions of dollars into certain facilities. Does that not take that school off the table, or are we considering that a sunk cost where even though we're investing $25 million into it this year, we're willing to close it next year?
So Trustee Mathias, this is the methodology and analysis that we're going to go through. We can't take schools out and not evaluate the whole, because there'll be programmatic components, there'll be deferred maintenance components, there'll be a lot of things that are considered. So, I believe that to be true to the methodology, we have to include all schools. I think it's important to state that if a school is going through a modernization project, the FCA scores and ESA scores, which will be hopefully near 100, will be considered as part of the analysis. And so using that logic, those schools are likely to not obviously be impacted the way others might.
So I guess my question is, what does that mean for anything that you might bring to this board during the next few months with respect to the investment in facilities, if that makes any sense? If you come to us next month with a roof replacement, or replacing the roof for the remainder of this year, next year, follow the...
So we always have to be mindful of warm, safe, dry, and we take that strategy to heart. Everything that we present to the trustees is always mindful of that balance that we have to strike, and it happens all the time, every single year. For instance, Rosedale is a school right now that's going through a modernization project, but their school needs support, and so we have to think about strategically adding dollars to improve the HVAC system. So everything we bring to you certainly has been thought of and in excruciating detail, but as we move through the scenarios, what you will see, trustee, is what the future cash flow projections would be for the 2017 bond and any future strategy that we might implement. Because if there is a change to a school that's not slated for a targeted project in 2022 or 2021, then we would bring to you a scenario that shows what that delta would be, and then we would, talk about what that, represents as far as transferring of projects or dollars by way of the CBOC or otherwise.
Okay. The second point, I think it's simply grammatical. All schools would be fabulous and comprise the best staff, teachers, and administrators. Maybe someone who knows English better than I might be able to answer whether it should be comprised or be comprised of. Number 3, we continue to see this word region, and I don't know if we're able to wrap some language or some thought around that to help. I think for us as trustees, the first time that we began to understand that a little more deeply was at the conversation. Was it last week, or whenever that conversation was? So I don't know, if there's some way that we can begin to articulate this for those who will be reading this document and wondering what these regions mean.
Certainly, and trustee, that's by design. We didn't want to present any regions or planning regions that we're going to be using in our methodology without really taking all the feedback and building the guiding principles as such. And so now, with staff in place, moving through the process, we'll be able to get feedback along the way and then get to where we can present them. I think it's important that we do communicate that the idea is that these planning regions are not tied by vertical team, feeder pattern. They are a more broad approach at how we look at geographic regions. We're trying to create an area large enough to introduce opportunity. So typically, historically, large thoroughfares such as I-35 were used as boundaries. That's likely not going to be the case as we look at these planning regions. So the idea right now is that we'll have those in draft form to Dr. Cruz here in the next couple weeks, and then we'll begin to work with y'all in a variety of ways to get feedback from y'all as we move through the process. But I envision between 8 and 12 elementary schools will likely be in a region. If you recall, in the 2017 FMP, we had clusters that were between 3 and 5. And when you look at how you balance whether it's deferred maintenance or long-term improvement FCA scores and ESA scores, I have few levers to pull. And so the idea is if we can come up a level and really look at all of our assets, we can really think creatively about how we can move us all in the right direction. So,
my next point, a truism is defined as a statement that is obviously true and says nothing new or interesting. I would argue that the last point, all means all, is a truism that says nothing new or interesting. It would be for us to say schools means schools or fabulous means fabulous. I hear this catchphrase in the district. I'm not sure what I'm sure it could be expressed in another way. And finally, I'll pile on with Trustee Tyke's suggestion that we be mindful of how it is that the possible consolidations of schools not disproportionately affect low-income kids and their families.
Trustee Ashe, and then Trustee Singh.
Hi guys, you're still here. That's great. Thanks. First day. I just have a couple of questions. I know one of the things we had talked about, it had come up a couple of times, was in the things that have numbers attached to them, like in ESA or an FCA, that we might give a little bit more definition to that by saying, so we would increase the average ESA score by X, and was just wondering if there's a reason why you decided not to do that in this document.
It's by design. I think it's conceivable, based on how the regions develop, that we're going to have goals. We want to move ourselves in a better direction. I think at this point, saying that we'll increase the FCA scores by 5% or 10% doesn't really reflect the work that we need to go through.
Okay.
The idea, I would say, is I would like to say we're going to reduce deferred maintenance by 15 or 20%, which would equate to $100 million in one area, and maybe it's $60 million in another area, mainly because of the condition the schools are in. So all of those things will be worked out, and we'll be able to provide more detail as we move through the methodology, which is one of the reasons I think a crucial next step is going to be the case study. So the idea is that we would present a case study and communicate to the trustees how the methodology would work, and I think in that case study you would see how each of these data sets would be leveraged.
That makes sense. And then my next point is, with full respect for everyone's opinion, that I actually would like to keep number 3 as number 3, and that the B would actually stay where it currently sits. I like the way that reads, given that the neighborhood schools is part of our core values that we read at the beginning of all of our meetings, and the research that supports what the neighborhood school is and how it has impacts how communities and schools is that similar model, and things of those nature. Having personally seen the effects of moving a school out of the neighborhood, even though temporarily, with with DOS having moved just across MOPAC, being that thoroughfare, and seeing our volunteerism decrease by 50%. I see the effects of that, and so that is something that I actually like the way that this is set about. And I think those were my 2 things. I guess the final point I was going to say about the ESA and the FCA is I just don't want to see us in a position where we increase the average ESA score by 1 point and say, but we did that. And I don't want it to feel disingenuous, if that makes sense. I want it to be something that's that was the reason I was asking that question. So, thank you, guys.
Thank you. And then we're going to have Trustee Singh, Trustee Cindy Anderson, then Trustee Wagner, and then Trustee Ellens, and then Trustee Teish. Did you?
All right. Okay, so thank you so much for so quickly turning this around and getting it back to us. I've had some time to think about this some more, and I have a few comments, and they're mostly equity kind of related, but just when we talk about the menu of programs, I just wanted to say that it's not just about the specialty programs, but it's just about making sure that we have high quality programs in the first place. And I think one of the things that comes to mind is that, like, Martin Middle School does not have an arts teacher. There are other schools that have had to cut kind of what we consider a basic part of the program of a school that just aren't there. So I guess that goes towards having all schools being fabulous. But I'm just saying, we're not just talking about the specialty things, but we're talking about kind of the basic programming. Another one is related to when we are looking at this comprehensive menu of programming, I'd like to think about how we determine that, like who defines what programs we want to have and where. And I'm wondering also, as we're going out and talking to the community, if that's one of the questions that comes up, is what kind of programming would you like to see here? And that also goes to what I think one of the main things I would like to see added to this, that I brought up in our retreat, and I heard some other trustees talking about it when we did our reflection around the table, was our programs and our schools are really only as good as our staff. And so I want to make sure that we think about, or maybe I have something under each of these sections or have its own section 6, which is something about human capital and ensuring that, we have really strong leaders, because if you think about it, with all these changes we're going to have to be doing, we're going to need true champions, at all of our campuses. And if we're talking about things like attracting people to come to Eastside schools from the West Side to help with the socioeconomic diversity, you're going to have a leader that's going to be able to kind of make that happen, and really just, not only for the kids that are coming over, but for the kids that are there, most importantly. And so I feel like we need something more explicit that relates to having fabulous, or comprising the best staff, teachers, and administrators, because we don't have a real strong statement underneath that I can see that relates to that. The other thing is about housing. We do have in section number 4, section 5, section 5, optimize facility use to benefit students, families, and communities. And we talked about potentially partnering with the city and others to do that. Do we have like a feasibility study, or is there any serious proposals we're looking at for converting some of our under-enrolled facilities into housing, either for students or for teachers?
So, Trustee, this process started a little while ago by way of the resolution the City of Austin passed. Mm-hmm. And so I started working with Nicole, but as well as Rodney Gonzalez, the Assistant City Manager, and started a joint collaborative planning meeting. And through that process, we've identified opportunities as far as housing needs within the city. They do have resources that can tell us, where there are housing deficiencies, how many, and what those deficiencies might look like and how they could be configured. I think one of the things that we're going to run into is, there's going to be a different solution for each site, based on its location, based on the opportunity from the City of Austin to provide value because it meets certain criteria regarding median family income. And so we'll test all those. We'll go through a market sounding analysis and we'll come up with a solution that we think works. So we are actively working with the City of Austin. They do have a lot of resources that we're leveraging through this process.
Okay. To me, that kind of goes back into making sure that all schools are fabulous. When you talk to a lot of families, one of the first things I hear is, our teachers don't live in our community. And so you kind of lose that, all those little casual interactions, that sense of community with the teachers. And, this speaks to the equity and having teachers who really understand where students are coming from. And I feel like if we really want to reinvent, our facilities and how they're used, I would love for us to very seriously pursue that if at all possible. And
I do want to say we are pursuing that.
Good.
What Matthias mentioned.
Thank
So after
you.
started meeting with the mayor, President Rodriguez was in those meetings to establish that potential relationship, which then came that city's resolution as a reinforcement, even with other city council members, to bring this forward. Now, we did include all of these potential opportunities. So part of the discussion that maybe could have happened, but I think with the board pretty much said, yes, let it be housing, private development, recreation, shared use. Every single one was listed. And there seemed to be agreement from the board of leave it all on there, and then we'll figure it out based on these opportunities with the city.
Great.
So I just want to make sure that there is firm commitment from the city and from us on working collaboratively to address community needs and any type of spaces that are available for those uses. We are certainly in collaboration with them.
That's
But
great.
we'll bring those to the board.
Great. And maybe this is implicit with the statement, the subheading for number 5, but I feel like I want to see something in here as a principle that we are, how do I say this? I guess preserving communities that have been historically, I want to say screwed, but what's the word is getting marginalized. Thank you. Sorry. You know what I'm saying. I know, sorry. I know, I did not sleep much last night. We just got a puppy, so. But so, I mean, I don't know, it's like, is that a value that we have? Is, deliberately trying to preserve communities where, communities that have been torn apart or been mistreated historically, not necessarily by the district, but just through, history, and what the city has been done in the past. So I want to just put that out there. Because I don't want this to just be, and I know it's not, but I want to make sure we're not just looking at, is it financially feasible? But that we do talk so much about building trust with communities, and so I just want you to know I want to champion that in particular. And just a couple of other things is the FAT Pack had some consolidation criteria, and most of them are reflected in here, but I'm not sure that I saw much in here about demographic data and projections and how that might fit into this. Is that in here?
In the, like as an underlay into the guiding principles?
Yeah.
So, not explicitly the way I think you're envisioning.
Okay.
The idea is, when you look at the data that we have, what data set and coupled with what other data sets are used to make an informed decision. And I think the strategy that we're trying to introduce allows us to identify scenarios that move us in the right direction and then confirm that scenario is in alignment with our guiding principles.
Yeah.
So to use that as the catalyst for the decision is different than using it as a check to confirm that your decision was in alignment with your guiding principles. And so I think that's where we need guidance from the board is,
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I bring that up is only because if we are ultimately going to be using that as a rationale for a consolidation, then it needs to be in this document. That's my opinion, so that we're totally transparent with the public. If there's anything like, political pressure, like whatever we're going to honestly use to make these scenarios and our ultimate decisions, I feel like it should be somewhere in this document, maybe not as a guiding principle, but as like something else. But I just feel like it's just another way to kind of make sure that we're on the right track. I don't know. Like, I'm not saying that I necessarily want to use demographic projections or that I want to use political will as a determinant for consolidations, but it's more like if that's something that's going to be a factor in your proposals, then we want you to be as transparent about that as possible, because people will see through that. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's a challenge to figure out how to bring that into the discussion the appropriate way, because in the modeling effort, we're trying to develop something that we can prove moves us in one direction or another based on the guiding principles and the factors. And so ideally, any scenario that we bring to you does a lot of things. Hopefully it reduces deferred maintenance. Hopefully it improves FCA scores. And the magnitude of which we can improve it is going to have an impact on something else. Maybe it's transportation costs.
Yeah.
Maybe, and so I think we have to really think about, how you balance all of this and where you want the board
I think we need
wants
to talk about that, because right now, demographic and population projections not in here at all.
Well,
does that mean that are they? Did I miss it?
It's not explicitly stated like that. If you look at 2C, increase building utilization while considering programs and boundaries. Boundaries is a little bit of that with the demographic projections. And then 2G, strengthen and stabilize population levels within feeder patterns.
Okay.
Trustee Singh, I don't know if this helps, but to me, I always think the population demographics are a big driver of why we're doing this, and they're not a guiding principle of it, but they're definitely a driver and a factor to be considered. I don't know if that's helpful.
Well, I don't know. I'm trying to think about how somebody might feel if we ultimately make a decision based on demographics and enrollment, and that is, they're going to be like, well, you said you were going to base it on other stuff, all these other things that are listed here, and not that. So it's really just a bigger question of kind of our, I don't know,
Well,
I just want to make sure that the public doesn't feel like we're lying, or
Sure.
that we're pulling the wool over their eyes. Like, if we're really going to do this and look at demographics, then it should be on here somewhere, maybe not as a guiding principle,
Sure.
but as a consideration or something, an inevitable consideration. I don't know.
Well, this entire process is transparent, and we're going to be held accountable in all kinds of ways. So maybe it can be in the strategic communication piece. I mean, we're going to have to explain all of this, and I'm sure they have the frequently asked questions, and they're going to have a lot of other data and information that they're going to communicate around how they get to where to their options.
Okay, and then just two more comments. One is, I would love for the trustees, and at some point to kind of, once this is in a more final form, to rank how important some of these guiding principles are, because I think that's going to weigh into the scenarios that you all develop. And I personally like the idea of moving 3B as the heading, optimize opportunities for socioeconomic diversity while balancing proximity to neighborhood schools. Just to kind of make that more prominent. That's just kind of my take on this. And can I just throw out one little idea that I've floated around to a few people in the community. But part of the reason I like having that more bold is so that it just stays higher on our radar. But I don't feel like we have to do this whole huge rezoning and everything like that. But what if we had a pilot program that really did model the kind of socioeconomic integration that we're hoping for? And it was at one of our under-enrolled schools. It was like a social justice curriculum that was sort of developed in our SEL programming. Those are the kinds of programs, like when we talk about the menu of programs, I don't think just about the programs we currently have, but more other programs that might actually meet some of these other goals that we have for our district. So we can pilot it, learn from it, grow from that, and maybe eventually we'll have one whole vertical team that has that model, and it can just grow. Kind of like we started with LAWSET, had all this high-tech stuff, and now we have Project Lead the Way in a whole bunch of schools. So it's just more of that more natural kind of approach where people are choosing the schools they're going to maybe integrate them a little bit more rather than having it forced upon them. So that's it for me.
Thank you. I have Trustee Cindy Anderson, and then Trustee Wagner, and then Trustee Ellens, and then Trustee Teisch.
Okay, I have a couple of comments. The first one is about 1B. Consider all regions for a district-wide holistic approach plus climate. I feel like the plus climate is not really connected to that, and that the intent with that from our discussion was, the importance of the school culture and climate, which is directly connected to the quality of teachers and the leadership at that school. And so the way it reads right now just seems like it could be interpreted as like the weather or something sort of random that I think deserves a standalone, that that the commitment is that every school will have high-quality teachers and leadership. On 2A and B, I think in order to keep things accessible in plain language, we need to spell out what those are. I mean, I know we know what they are, but not everybody knows what they are. And then, you had another document that you shared at the retreat that included definitions. And so I think something like that, perhaps as an attachment, as this is being communicated to the general public, would be very helpful for folks that don't always understand our edu-speak. The title of number 3, I think the other point regarding the request to move B up as the title is that the reality is that neighborhood schools will be consolidated. And so if you say you're maintaining them but consolidating them at the same time, it's really a conflicting statement. And so instead, I think the intent is to perhaps redefine what that means. I mean, we know that 88% of our families choose currently their neighborhood school. So really it's more about geographic proximity as opposed to, I think it's just too conflicting to say, you're going to keep them, but you're going to consolidate them too. And so I think that somehow redefining that, whether we use B exactly or, use B as the title, but then define what geographic proximity means in terms of the ideal, knowing that we have families with transportation issues, knowing that Cap Metro has changed their routes as we talked about, and in terms of still providing that access to families and to ensure that we respect that as a value that 88% have chosen. Related to that, I absolutely understand the concept of wanting to have sort of more teeth to that equitable distribution and not disproportionately affecting any particular area. I think the challenge of that as you operationalize it is that when you think about, we've got 79 Title I schools, we've got another dozen, perhaps two, that would qualify under the federal threshold, and where the geographic distribution is, that it's sort of like going from 0 to 100, and that, as we think about like scorecard metrics, we have kind of interim goals, something that would establish more of a concrete commitment, but something that's feasible, because you can still have a geographic distribution, but it may take us a long time to reach what is the district average, just given the number of schools we have that have a minority of students. I think it's going to be very difficult to hold true to that, and I want to make sure we set this process up with the greatest chance of success. And so I'm not opposed to some sort of metric in there, but I think it would be very challenging, just given the reality of the current distribution, to go from where we are now to the perfect scenario in one swoop. So I just want to throw that out there. And then really my last comment is more connected to the reinvention roadmap, but Matthias, as you discussed in the board retreat, that as we look towards repurposing funds for kind of those Band-Aid type items. What I don't see on the roadmap is a conversation with the CBOC, and feel like that they should be involved in how those funds get redistributed and part of that conversation. And so, and that may be your intent, but I would just appreciate seeing, as I think they would, in planning their work, to know that there's going to be a point where the right point in that roadmap is for them to have that conversation and be involved with how that plays out, to ensure that equity exists in that respect too, and that there's some additional input in how those funds get redistributed.
Trustee Anderson, great comment, and I've made a commitment to brief the CBOC every time we meet. We have a standing agenda item for this very topic, and I'm kind of getting them to a point so that we begin to introduce these scenarios. They understand what the ask is going to be if they are indeed approved scenarios. So we are going through that process, and I will make an effort to kind of show all the different parties, because we are going to the Fab Pack, we are going to be going to the DAC. And so maybe I can communicate that a little bit differently.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Wagner.
All right. Well, thank you for bringing this back to us again so quickly for input. The place I wanted to start is by asking the same question that I asked the last time we met to start off, which is, who is the intended audience for these principles? Because I don't know that I really got as clear of an answer to that question as I had hoped for last time. So, Dr. Cruz, I don't know if you want to answer that?
Sure. As far as the approval is to the board, the way and the audience we're going to use this is really for us to then, once we've created the regions, is then to apply it, to develop a case study, then to apply then what any potential options could be. So we would be using this to apply those to apply the development of what's going to happen within a region. Mm-hmm. So it is really for us to use, but what of course we want is board approval, board input, and of course with this, many folks have weighed in on it. And not only CBOC has a standing item on this, DAC also has a standing item on this as well. But it is really for us to use in the implementation, the development of the regions, and any options that we're going to bring to the board around boundary changes, consolidations, repurposing.
Mm-hmm. I think the reason I asked that is because what I think is still a little bit surprising to me, for if this is being used for planning purposes and staff purposes as sort of a guidance rubric of how to weigh and review decisions, that except for the chunk in section 2, which looks suspiciously like they may have been written by an engineer because they are very clearly defined. The others are all still pretty subjective. In fact, I'm hard pressed to find one that isn't subjective. You know, things like increase the comprehensive menu of programs to appeal to diverse student interests. Whose interests and what kind of interests and what does appeal mean and what does increase mean and what does comprehensive mean? You know, there's a lot of subjectivity built into that sentence. Strengthen the connection of programming within the feeder pattern. I mean, I can infer what you guys are getting to, but I think there's still a lot of interpretation to be had within all of these statements. And so that really makes me wonder if you guys are using this as very clear and specific guidance around how you're making decisions, and there's this much subjectivity built into the principles. Are we going to get where we need to be? Is this helping you guys in the way that it needs to help you in terms of having a board stamp of approval if each of the 9 of us thinks something means something different? So that would really be my biggest question overall. I think I'm with a few of the other trustees in terms of the kind of the aspirational statements at the beginning. I think we have to be very careful in that we have a community that has been made promises to in the past and has been delivered, you know, fluffy aspirational statements in the past that we haven't delivered on. So I think if we're going to them saying all schools will be fabulous, and that hasn't been the case for me the last 5 times I was promised something, it's a little bit harder for me to take that earnestly and feel like there really is teeth behind a statement like that. So I think it's just making sure that I would rather see us being much more explicit and direct as far as what our intent is. And I don't know if getting us to a plain language state, as Trustee Cindy Anderson mentioned, is a good start, but I think there is a place for aspirational language if we're trying to communicate a vision, but if we're using this as a true planning tool, I feel like we need to be more explicit and direct in what we mean. One thing I did want to ask is to the engineer, what does strengthen and stabilize population levels between feeder patterns mean?
So the idea behind that factor is if a consolidation is going to be considered and there are 2 schools that we might be evaluating, if one school, if the students were moving and transferred to an adjacent school or nearby school, and it strengthened that feeder pattern, then would that be something we would consider as the receiving school opposed to a school that is in a different direction that maybe wouldn't strengthen that feeder pattern? And the idea is if we what we want to do is create a student population, a base that would support the middle school and then high school. So case in point would be a school like Sanchez. If we were going to look at, again, it's hypothetical, because the modernization project there. You know, what if you were to make a decision on that school, you know, how might that play into it? And the idea is, overall, as we develop these scenarios, you would like to strengthen feeder patterns wherever possible.
So again, to me, like the word strengthen feeder patterns is still a little bit, even hearing you talk about it is a little ambiguous. It wasn't until you got to the example of Sanchez that I was quite certain what that meant in terms of right now we have a school that splits to more than one high school. So we're talking about trying to have more pure feeder patterns or more pure vertical teams, or I mean, it's really, I mean, I guess what I'm also poking at too is, first, I honestly didn't understand exactly what that meant in reading it. And secondly, is that explicit enough for folks to understand they're doing the planning?
Well, and Trustee, I think the challenge that we're running into is that these factors are meant to be tested against a case study. You know, and the reason the factors beneath guiding principle number 2 are very clearly defined, or at least is because they're data driven. I mean, it's easier to kind of quantify and then say, okay, this is where we are, this is where we want to go. I think the others we need to look at and analyze via case study and say, okay, what does that mean to the trustees and how are we going to measure it? Because there are some things that are softer in here and we can't really begin to measure them until we know what our measuring stick is. And I think this process by design allows for y'all, by participating in the case study, to kind of help us work through that process, because we wouldn't want to come here and say this is how we would want to measure that. But we know that's important. We just don't know necessarily the proper way to measure it at this point until we get feedback.
Yeah, and so I guess, back to that though, I mean, you say we know what's important, and I think most everything that's on this page is something that, even before it was documented, we all could have come to agreement that, based on our knowledge of the district, that we would have felt like were important things to consider. But if we are going through the time of documenting this and documenting it in a public-facing fashion, the public needs to be just as clear about it as we are. And so, so that's part of being explicit about what we mean here as well, not only for our understanding between the board and your work, but also so that the public can see transparently what our intent is and why we're making the decisions that we're making. I just wanted to touch on too, the conversations that we've had around, and I think some of it's coming in the way of input from the community around percentages. I think what makes me a little bit nervous about that, or, you know, we are in a city that is changing rapidly demographically, and I'm a little bit concerned that if we start to pin down percentages in a very particular way, or that we essentially start to draw circles around communities that we're not going to touch because we're going to disrupt, we may inadvertently be taking opportunities away from those very same communities in the way of modernized facilities, deeper investments in those areas, because we're sort of leaving them alone and leaving them to stay in the same state that they're in now. And that is not something I'm content to do. And so I just want to be sure that we think about both sides of that equation. I think that there is goodness around looking at creating more diverse school structures. I think there's multiple mechanisms to do that. Since our city is so radically economically segregated as it is, I think it's very challenging to do that just by virtue of buildings and boundaries. I think it's something that we really have to go back to some of the pieces around programmatic deserts, around creating hubs for programs, things that will really be attractors for communities. So with all of that, I think that, to my mind, is the key to get us where we get to a more diverse and integrated model across the district. So it's, for me, I want to be very careful in how the parameters that we put around that, so that we don't inadvertently limit some of our historically underserved communities at the same time as we're trying to protect and benefit them.
Thank you. Trustee Ellens, and then Trustee Teich, and then Trustee Shane.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how, what was the process by which you went from the retreat to this document today?
So we all got together and collaborated. We took all the notes that we had taken from that evening and looked at the common themes and tried to include that in here. So you can see, for example, Guiding Principle 1 changed because there was discussion about the engaging, really liking that language about engaging and inspiring that was down under number 2, Guiding Principle 2, and adding that, feeling, you know, that there was a sentiment that be included in Guiding Principle 1. We heard about the figuring out a way to include staff in here, and, you know, that's difficult to put as can be difficult to put as a guiding principle, and so that was included up at the very top of comprised. You know, so there's pieces. The other, even in looking at also under Guiding Principle 1, I believe it's D, ensuring specialized services and programs are provided to meet the diversity of student needs and remove barriers to academic success. You know, that was the one that listed out specific programs. And so we felt removing that and adding your language in here, and then adding those different programs in the glossary to define that there. So we really tried to incorporate what your thinking was, what you shared that evening across the groups, into this document.
And then I might have zoned out. What is the next step from tonight's session?
So, Trustee, we're going to work with leadership to make any adjustments, and then as we communicated in the board retreat, we're going to present it to FAPAC and get feedback, as well as the DAC. And so the idea is we would present the guiding principles, take them through it and the logic as to how we got there, and then receive that feedback, and then communicate that back to y'all for final approval in May.
So, but when I see all this language, there's also these scenarios. When does that come into it?
So as right now, what we'd like to do is to move forward with building the planning regions, the regions themselves. The idea is that we would work with staff and present those to Dr. Cruz starting this week, and then finalize them a week from next week, and then bring those to y'all. And there'd be multiple ideas about how those planning regions were developed. But we would have something that we'd recommend to y'all to begin considering. The idea is that the planning regions, which will be the foundation for the methodology, kind of coincide with final adoption or approval of the guiding principles. And then that sets us up nicely for the case study, and then we're off and running producing scenarios.
Okay, I'm just, I'm struggling a little bit with our timeline.
Sure.
and what, it's changed over time a little bit. And so originally we were approving, well, not originally, but at some iteration, we were approving these guidelines in April.
Mm-hmm.
And then it got moved to May, and the language is now the guidelines and the scenarios. So I'm trying to help us schedule our meetings.
So, so when we moved the approval of the scenarios to October, we adjusted the schedules. In the last iteration, we had coming to the board in a work session to get the guiding principles, to get feedback on them. We would get the guiding principles approved in May, and we would communicate to you all at that point as well the current development of the scenarios and methodology. Really what's
So
happening
it's
is
the
that...
scenario criteria. We won't be able to go through those scenarios before we approve the principles.
Correct. What you'll go through is a case study. I mean, and I think that's what's important is I'd like you all to understand how we plan to use the data sets. So once we have a planning region and we have FCA scores, deferred maintenance over an area, we'll communicate to y'all how we plan to tackle that problem by way of a methodology. That methodology will yield scenarios. These scenarios will then be tested against the guiding principles, and by way of that process, we'll begin to filter out the ones that do move the needle and benefit us as an organization, but also are mindful of the guiding principles that we've agreed to.
Okay. So we'll need to kind of think through how we're going to schedule those conversations, I think. But in the meantime, I think several trustees have hit on so many of the things I wanted to say, so trying to pull it all together. I think it is important that we understand that this document is an internal document. I don't think I understood that before, because one of my things I was really trying to work through is how is it more of an inspirational document for the public to but if that's not the intent, kind of have to get my head around a little different. And with that in mind, I very much support making it more clear and more specific to what you mean here. And I mean, I have some of the notes from the other day too, and I'm thinking, okay, I think they fit in that ESA, but without having that fully kind of vetted through, it's hard to say where you took our feedback sometimes. So I'll be interested to see. I don't know if I'll know what my next steps need to be till I see the next version, unless you really are just editing.
At this point, we would be making modifications to the guiding principles, edits based on feedback from this meeting, as well as anything that we might want to bring to y'all from the FATPAC or the DAZ.
Okay. Well, I'm also confused a little bit by the comprehensive menu of programs. I think that we've been haphazard at best in the way we've done this in the past. For me, I do think that the variety that we offer is important, but the way it's not coming across in this sentence. So it's stuff like that I'm struggling with a little bit. For me, I've said it many times that we shouldn't be putting a random program here and a random program here, and where there's no alignment, and that they should be being able to strengthen through a pattern, a feeder pattern. And for me, that would be a huge key item to see in here. And I don't really see it. I saw that it was sort of added into one of those bullets, but when we have this, I feel like we're getting back into the KPI problem we had with our previous strategic plan, where there's so many things, everything's going to fit. So it's what happens when we do a principal assessment. We ask people to tell us what they want, and there's 5 pages of documents, and so everybody fits. So I would love to see this streamlined, and I don't know if it's by prioritizing or whatever, but I am also struggling how it will help you make decisions. And that's why I was kind of very hopeful that maybe even we could go through the case study even next Monday, so that we could start, maybe this makes so sense to you, but until we do that, we're struggling a little bit.
I think that's a point well taken. It is hard to envision the entire process without thinking about how we might use each of these guiding principles and factors. So I think what we'll do is get with Dr. Cruz and see, how we might do that.
Yeah, especially for Monday is one thing we talked about, that there's an opportunity there to start looking at regions, criteria for the regions, or, we sort of talked about that, but then also how this is going to be applied. I do think the question as far as the application piece is the prioritization. Do we want to prioritize and say, out of everything you're going to do, these are the 5 things that it needs to reflect it? I do think that right now, I think there's some language maybe to fix. If we want to remove the first elements, the first 5 lines, where that, I do think it's always important to have the visionary piece to it, but it doesn't have to explicitly be here. I do think what I may be hearing different sides is around the neighborhood school. And so that one, I do think we're going to have to address. So either right now it is based on neighborhood. So that has been our model. That has been the plan. And so that's what's reflected here. So I think that's one item that I don't right now have clarity on. Should be optimized opportunity for socioeconomic, and then move up, switch them around is one. And then the question that came up, let's prioritize.
Well, I if this is an internal document, again, I would look to you guys to be doing that part of the work, to be honest. I know we said we want the board to own that equity piece and all that, but I'm not sure. I kind of feel like we went in kind of divergent directions with where I thought we were going with that equity piece, and then these are guiding principles for your decision-making. I'm really sorry. It's late, and maybe I'm just confusing the conversation. But I will talk, my perspective on the neighborhood schools is, for me, personally, I do think we need to define it. My kids went to an elementary school that was 50% transfer, and every student there thought they were at a neighborhood school. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there's some definition that needs to be there. I will say, working with the city, I was on their mobility task force. The city of Austin is doing everything in its power to get people off the roads. I think it would be very important for us to consider this transportation piece and the proximity to our schools. They are investing in sidewalks and bike paths and all this stuff, and there's a perfect opportunity for us to be partnering with them to improve safety in all of that world. And for me, the way we do get the diversity is through our programs. So I don't mean to be, earlier I said the comprehensive menu is haphazard, but we could be doing that with intention in a way that would create the socioeconomic piece, because everything we're doing today is choice-based. Charters, private schools, all of our stuff, that has to be our driver. And so if your driver is you need proximity to your school, we can't get rid of that option. If your driver is, and we can show through our studies that academic levels increase with diversity, then people are going to choose those options. And so I think that, for me, I'm wondering if you just take out the bullet and it just fits into the whole, you keep both of the tabs, A and B just become H and J. Because it's just part of all of this work. And for me, neighborhood proximity is more valuable at the elementary. A lot more middle and high schoolers choose different options. I think it was, would you say 88%
Overall.
overall? Do you have that broken down by segment? That
think we
would,
do.
that would be an interesting data
migration
point
data.
for us to understand, because we don't want to make this hard on anybody either. I think that's a little bit of what Trustee Wagner was saying. All of a sudden, we force people where they're not able to participate in their schools. That hurts every campus, every child. So, so I don't know if that helped give you a little guidance. For me, I could keep it as is. I could get rid of the title altogether. I am for balancing the socioeconomic diversity. I wouldn't choose public schools in Austin, Texas if I wasn't for it. And I think that's where our starting point has to be. The people who are here are choosing public schools partly for this diversity and socioeconomic spacing. The ones who don't want that have already jumped ship to private, or they're at Eanes, or they're at Lake Travis. They've already chosen. We don't want to drive more away. We want to embrace that they've chosen this and make sure that they have choices around town. Trustee Mathias had said something at the meeting that I don't see reflected here, so I was just going to ask if there was a reason on 4C, minimize negative impact to taxpayers. And the input, we were like, okay, what does that mean necessarily? And so what we were told at the time, that it was from future bonds. So it was very facility focused in that the deferred maintenance piece and all of those things that you've been talking about. And so they had indicated that you might add the from future bonds
Component
in
of it.
there, but you didn't. So I'm wondering if there's a reason that it means more than that.
So I believe that it means more than that.
Okay.
You know, there's multiple ways to measure the taxpayer burden. And so capital bonds, you know, through bond expenditures is one way, certainly. But the thought was, if we're going to measure long-term reduction in deferred maintenance, that's also another impact that is going to impact our taxpayer. And so for me, it's all encompassing.
And that's not future bonds.
That's not future bonds.
M&O.
That's exactly
Okay,
right. So
I
that
see.
we can maybe
Okay.
add some clarification around it, but we left it broad enough so we could measure
Okay.
it multiple ways. And I think that's what you'll find when we go through the case study is many of these factors will actually be measured maybe one or two or three different ways, which is why at the top we actually talked about regionally, per student, per campus. There'll be a lot of things that come out of it. This is meant to be the framework for the methodology, not necessarily the final be-all measuring stick. So that's, it's just the process we have to go through to get to an appropriate methodology.
Okay. I think those are my main things. I'm just trying to figure out what we need to schedule and how we need to schedule it.
I think
So-
it's on Monday.
Well,
We'll
I
have to-
think we're going to talk to Dr. Cruz tomorrow to see if they're going to be ready. And if they're not ready, I think we can do strategic plan work.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it would be nice, I thought we were moving or consolidating or moving the vote to May so that we could sort of understand how things are impacted with scenarios. Because I think we could say, oh, that's not what we meant for that to happen. So it'd be nice to be able to play those out before we officially approve this final document.
I understand. I think testing the methodology before we agree to the guiding principles is an important step. I would say going through all the scenarios is not necessarily.
No, just testing the process. I'm with them. Thank you.
So just a little bit of a time check. We're like 21 minutes past the time we scheduled, but I still have Trustee Teish and Trustee Singh and anyone else who wants to, and Trustee Anderson. So Trustee Teish?
So guiding principles, and I just did a quick scan of a bunch of definitions of guiding principles, business principles, et cetera, are designed to be broad philosophies. They're not designed to be terribly specific. And so unless you're doing a project, and in that case, you might be more specific. So I'm comfortable with the language that we have here. I'm assuming that you will flesh those out with details. And so guiding principles for me, these are fine right here. I kind of support what Trustee Ellen said about eliminating Roman numeral 3 and moving A and B and making them H, G, and H and I, basically. I think it's important for us I think it would be helpful to strengthen Roman numeral 2, for example. I'm okay with that. I think while we're going through this whole process, and by the way, I have some not under-enrolled schools, I have some small schools in my district, Ridgetop and Riley in particular, which are very old buildings. Ridgetop is well constructed. It's one of what I call the red brick buildings. It's well constructed, but it is small and it is full because of our offerings of choice. So I just want to put this caution out to everybody that in our system of choice, people with resources create less choice for people without resources. They overwhelm our schools. And so we need to be careful about that when we are talking about programming. Ridgetop is full. Riley is becoming full because of its Mandarin dual language program. And we need to be careful about what we do with the choices and where we put those choices. When we decided back in the day to have a liberal arts academy at Johnston and a science academy at LBJ, we created a lot of furor in the district. And then when we combined those two programs at LBJ, we created even more disruption in the district. We need to be very careful, and we need to be talking to our school communities, particularly those schools that we may want to repurpose or that we may want to consolidate, to see how those proposals resonate with our community. So that communication piece is critical. And we also need, like I said, to be careful that we don't create situations where neighborhoods cannot get their kids into schools in their neighborhoods because they're overwhelmed by the choice that people with resources have decided they're going to, like, hey, we want to do that school. We want our kid in that dual language school. And, there are no more spaces for our neighborhood kids. So I think we need to be very sensitive to that. Also, I think that we need to be, and this is something that Trustee Mathias mentioned in our discussions, is that we need to let the public know that we've got, about 60 schools that really ought to be consolidated or closed or repurposed or something like that. Always start high. If we wanted to be truly, truly, truly efficient, okay? I talk with trustees and superintendents around the Central Texas area, and they're always asking, why? Why do you keep some of these schools open? It's terribly inefficient to do that. And in this school district, we're very sensitive to our communities, particularly those communities that have been historically not been responded to well by our school superintendents, plural, and by trustees of the past. So this is a very delicate thing. We need to approach it carefully. We need to have discussions, but we also need to realize at some point we are being inefficient in the use of our facilities, and we are not being 21st century. So I'm going to offer for Fabulous that we substitute 21st century in there, because I did a quick scan of 21st century education on my phone, and we have all sorts of language around 21st century schools. And our Department of Education has a program devoted to programming for 21st century schools, our U.S. department. So I would offer that because I think that's what we're trying to achieve for our students, is we put them in facilities that facilitate 21st century learning. And there are tons of lists of criteria as to what that actually means. So we can go back and look at that. So I'm going to offer all of that commentary, and I'm particularly heartened that this board is sensitive to communities that have been historically disregarded. And I'm also heartened that our staff is sensitive to that too. I see a lot of hope in us moving in a direction that is more equitable than I've ever seen in the past. And I've been associated with the district since 1964, when I was in the 6th grade at Lucy Reed Elementary. So I'm done.
Thank you, Trustee Tyson. Trustee Singh, and then Trustee Cindy Anderson, and then Trustee Matthias. You'll pass. Trustee Cindy Anderson.
I just wanted to end on highlighting something that Trustee Wagner said that I think still gets overlooked in this conversation, that this is seemingly a very kind of negative type of initiative. It's very disruptive. It's very scary. It creates a lot of chaos. But the underlying fundamental rationale for this is to put kids in not just better facilities, but significantly better academic situations. And so to her point, and I'm not going to say it nearly as eloquently as she did, as we're looking at where that balance is and determining what the best targets are to operationalize this work, we don't want an unintended consequence of avoiding certain populations that have been historically marginalized, that in many cases don't have the same type of access to curriculum or have facilities that are worse off, and not engage them and involve them in this process that is going to elevate the situation for their children, which will have a direct correlation to improved academic outcomes. So it's a delicate balance, I think, between having some teeth to some accountability as to how we really do look at things from an equitable perspective, but also not limit ourselves to what is the very clear intention of improving the spaces and the outcomes for all kids. And so I just wanted to highlight that because I thought that was very well said.
Thank you, Trustee Matthias.
I really appreciate Trustee Tyke's words. And the number that I had used at a previous board retreat was 37. I had said that were we to operate at the same efficiencies as other districts like, and I just crunched the numbers for Cypress Fairbanks Independent School District, that today we would shutter 37 schools. Now, I'm not saying that we should shutter 37 schools, but what I'm thinking, my final comment for the board as part of this conversation is that I think that we need to be clear with the superintendent on what it is that we are mandating him to do. And I would be happy for us to put that in the form of a number, because as I look in the figurative crystal ball, what I foresee happening is that the staff is going to bring us a recommendation, communities will organize, and this board will succumb to whatever pressures to take staff's recommendations and whittle that list down to a few palatable options for the board. And I would hate to see that happen. I would just as soon, see us be strategic and think, today we have 100 schools. If we were to operate at the efficiency of a Cy-Fair, that would mean 93 schools. I'm not proposing that we would have 93 outstanding schools, but maybe that number is 100 outstanding schools, or 110, or 120, so that we're giving the superintendent clear direction. If it's 120 at the end of the day, that's great. I can live with that. At least he has clear direction, and what we get back is something in line with our expectations, rather than 129 schools at the end of the day. So I'm happy to advocate for this board taking a strong stance in that respect, if there are other voices who might be in accord.
So, Trustee Tyson.
Yes, and thank you for correcting my math. Yeah, I would support that. I think we need to be realistic, and our community needs to be realistic, and we need to quit beating around the bush, basically, and just saying we can keep everything open and everything is going to be wonderful. And I think our community, particularly a community that advocates for our Title I school communities, need to go out and see some of the schools that our Title I students are actually learning in and that our staff are teaching in. And see the reality of what they're working in, and not be so attached to the brick and mortar, and understand that it would be better to have the students and staff learning and teaching in facilities that rival, that are as good as or better than what I see in Pflugerville and Leander and Manor and ISD and Del Valley. So I think people need to start looking at these other schools and understanding that our schools pale in many instances by comparison.
Thank you, Trustee Tyson. Any other comments from trustees? Trustee Ellens.
So can I just ask Trustee Matthias, is that something maybe to put into our conversation with strategic plan and put it in the scorecard? Is that what you're suggesting?
That's one possibility. I'm open to possibilities. I think another possibility is for us in a document like the one that's presented to us this evening is to say that our goal is, and then to get that goal. I'm just going to throw out, our goal is to have 120 outstanding schools, and I just made up that number, lowballing what perhaps I would otherwise be tempted to suggest.
Okay, thanks. I have to think about it.
So we'll have more discussion next Monday, right? So a lot to think about. Any other last comments? If not, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.